This meeting.
Alrighty, so thank you all for joining us this evening for one of our webinars in our Land Managers Toolbox webinar and workshop series. So today what we're going to be covering is kind of prescribed burning in Arkansas and why we burn. So we're not going to get into a lot of the technical side of burning. We do have on our Quail Forever in Arkansas YouTube page access to the Learn to Burn videos that will take you completely through the Learn to Burn 1 class that Quail Forever and the Arkansas Game and Fish put together. So if you'd like more information on kind of burn plan writing and burn weather and all that stuff to actually implement a burn, you can go check those videos out on our YouTube page. So today we're really just going to be focusing again on why we burn and kind of what situations where we use fire as a management tool here in Arkansas. And I guess I'll do some introductions too before we start. So my name is Jessica Cox. I'm a Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist out of the Fort Smith area. So I kind of cover the west central part of the state. And also with us today, we have Katrina Sims, who's also a Farm Bill biologist for Quail Forever. And she is in Northwest and North Central Arkansas based out of Harrison. She's gonna also be with us for this webinar to help answer questions. All right, so jumping right into it, what is prescribed burning? And I'm going to turn my video off. It just kind of helps the thing move a little bit slower, or not slower, but better. So what is prescribed burning? Very important question. So there's prescribed burning and then there's wildfire. So there's definitely distinctions between the two. So prescribed fire is the planned ignition of a designated burn unit to achieve management objectives. So these objectives are met and the burn is done according to a prescribed burn plan that's put together prior to the burn being completed. So that planned is very important and a designated burn unit. So we have a specific area that we're looking to achieve management objectives on, and we're going to burn it. So, and in that prescribed burn plan, we're going to be going over timing and weather, fuel load considerations, topography, fire break locations, personnel and equipment. The objectives that you have are going to be laid out, and then what techniques. So you can see there's a lot that goes into a prescribed burn plan. A wildfire, on the other hand, is the unplanned ignition of just an area caused by natural causes, human ignitions, or sometimes escaped prescribed burns. So wildfires are uncontrollable, they're unpredictable. They will destroy ecosystems and structures. They pose threats to life and property, and oftentimes the planning for a wildfire comes post-ignition, and the control of a wildfire comes post-ignition of the actual fire. So those are the distinctions between prescribed fire and wildfire. So as you can see in these pictures, what you have on the left side of the screen is a prescribed fire, and what in the picture on the right is of a wildfire. So you can clearly in these two pictures see the differences between the two types of fire. So the prescribed fire, you've got a fire break running through there that's controlling that fire, keeping it in that burn unit. You've got low flame lengths. The flames are on the ground. They're not running through the trees. And then in the wildfire, you've got what we call, a crown fire. The fire has reached into the tops of the trees. So not only is that fire moving along the ground, it's also moving across the tops of the trees. And that's going to cause a lot of issues, tree mortality, like I said, that ecosystem structural destruction. So now that we've kind of gone over what a prescribed fire is, I want to go a little bit into the history of prescribed fire in Arkansas. So this isn't going to be a very detailed history lesson, but just to let you kind of know where fire kind of started in the landscape and to where we kind of are now with it, just briefly. So this map right here shows the mean fire interval, which means the amount of time that fire, how many years in between fire being on the landscape. So if you look at Arkansas, you can see there's a couple of spots up near the Ozarks and towards the River Valley, that yellow, that had a little bit higher mean fire interval return. But for the most part, you're looking at the majority of the states saw between a for an 8-year fire interval. So that means that the land in Arkansas would have burned, every 4 to 8 years, those sites would have seen fire on the landscape. Now, those fires could have been during the summer, they could have been during the winter, they could have been caused by, lightning strikes, several causes. But just to kind of give you an idea of how fire would have behaved historically on the landscape. So looking at early prescribed fire, so Arkansas has been inhabited for thousands of years. So early Native Americans were really the first to use prescribed fire to help shape the landscape. So they saw the effects that fire had on the ecosystem, and they used that to their advantage. It's also important to note that at this time, large landscape scale fires still would have been very common, again, in that 4 to 8 year fire return interval. But also now you have Native Americans that are applying fire to the land to benefit them. So then we fast forward a little bit, and then we start to see European settlement of Arkansas. So in 1541, Hernando de Soto led the first expedition into Arkansas. We saw the first European settlement established in 1686. And then in the 1820s, so pictured here is Thomas Nuttall. So he was one of the first naturalists to really survey the landscape of Arkansas, and he took very detailed notes on the flora and fauna of Arkansas and what he saw. So during this time, what he recorded was a totally different picture than what we see today. So he saw open prairies with bison, and then open woodlands. Woodlands so open that covered wagons could move through these forests. I know that's kind of hard to picture, especially with the way our forests look today, but historically, because of fire maintaining those open conditions, that's what they would have seen, and that's what Arkansas would have looked like. Now, as more people started to settle in the state, we saw less and less landscape scale fires, and also we started to see a decrease in the use of prescribed fire, because of that kind of people and wildland interface. So then we move into, fast forwarding way forward into time. Again, we're seeing the decrease in fire across the landscape. But then in 1944, the Smoky Bear Wildlife Prevention Campaign began. It's actually the longest running campaign in US history. And it started shortly after World War II, because when all of our firefighters and a lot of the able-bodied men were deployed, the folks left back at home were having to be the ones to control wildfires. And so they started the Smoky Bear Wildlife Prevention Campaign in order to try to mitigate and stop wildfires before they began, so educating the public. However, while these were all great intentions, it didn't create a fear of fire, but it did perpetuate kind of a fear of all fire, that all fire is bad. So the picture that you see here is actually the first slogan that they came out with, and it says, "Care will prevent 9 out of 10 woods fires." So that slogan was updated later to say only you can prevent forest fires, and then it was updated again in 2001 to only you can prevent wildfires. And that was done in order to make the distinction between wildfires and prescribed fires, to kind of get the public awareness up that not all fire is bad, and that many of our ecosystems actually depend on fire to be successful. And then from 1944, when that campaign started, up till roughly 2015 here in Arkansas, give or take a few years, prescribed fire was rarely used on the landscape, and these large landscape scale fires were basically non-existent at this point. So that brings us to prescribed fire today and where we're at. And thankfully, things are looking very good. So, reintroducing prescribed fire in Arkansas. So around 2015, we saw an increase in the funding and the use of prescribed fire as a management tool by various agencies. And today we're seeing thousands of acres burned annually, and that's a combination of agency burns, but also landowners getting out there. So we've seen a huge increase in landowners taking interest in habitat management and wanting to incorporate fire back onto the landscape. And also because of this, by reintroducing fire into the landscape, we've also seen a decrease in the number and the severity of wildfires in Arkansas. So the use and the reintroduction of prescribed fire in Arkansas has been a positive, has definitely made positive impacts on our landscape. So some of the ways that we've been able to reintroduce prescribed fire in Arkansas, besides just agency personnel going out and conducting these burns, is we have been involved in the creation of prescribed burn associations. Now we're doing our next webinar in a couple of weeks over prescribed burn associations and what they are. So if you're interested in that, make sure you tune into the next webinar. But essentially they're just landowners helping landowners burn their private lands. So, you know, the biggest thing for landowners when burning usually is getting the number of people you need and having the right equipment to do the burn. So Quail Forever, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, and a couple of other agencies have pooled resources, and we've been able to fund trailers that have equipment that landowners can use, and then the landowners have access to the members of the Prescribed Burn Association to actually conduct these burns on their own. So because of that, we've been able to get more acres burned on the ground. Quail Forever has also implemented within the last couple of years a habitat crew that is able to go out and assist private landowners with prescribed burns. And this is really important because the majority of Arkansas is privately owned. So in order to get the acres we need burned, we have to get those private landowners engaged with using prescribed fire. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we are offering with the Game and Fish Commission these Learn to Burn classes, and that's educating landowners on the proper use and execution of prescribed fire. So the Learn to Burn 1 class can be found on our YouTube page. It's a series of videos that goes through all the nitty-gritty of what you need to do to prepare a prescribed burn. And then we're also doing Learn to Burn 2 classes where we actually get landowners out on the fire line and show them how to execute a prescribed burn using what they learned in the Learn to Burn 1 class. So this picture here is a picture of us with one of the prescribed burn associations that we started in North Central Arkansas. So this is the North Central Prescribed Burn Association. Just a great group of people that, you know, they were really scared of fire at first, but now they absolutely love it. And it's just been a great experience getting to work with them. And then real quick, just some examples of some projects where prescribed fire was used. So as you can see in the picture on the left, this was a plot that was taken before prescribed burning was applied to the site. You can see the little guy standing back there. He's kind of hidden by all the mid-story coming in after utilizing prescribed fire on this property. The picture on the left shows post-prescribed fire, and you can clearly see the guy standing there. So we've really opened up those conditions, and we'll go into why that's beneficial here shortly. And another example of a field. So in this picture, you can see the side on the left has not been burned, while the side on the right has been burned. So you can see the difference in having fire on the ground versus not having fire on the ground. And like I said, fire shaped the Arkansas landscape. So making sure that we're implementing that and using it as a tool really helps us to build the best habitat possible and really do habitat and ecological restoration. So now we're going to go into a little bit about why we burn. So if you're a landowner and you've got property, why would you want to incorporate prescribed fire on your property? So these are what we call management objectives. So the management objectives that you choose are, you have to ask yourself, why are you burning? What do you want to accomplish with this burn? And that can be a number of things we'll go through here in a minute. When you're outlining these objectives, we want to make sure that those are quantifiable objectives. So for example, we need to put a number with it because we use these to measure the success of a burn. So for example, if you have a native plant, a native grass and wildflower stand, and you're getting some woody encroachment, say you're getting some cedar, some persimmon coming in, and you want to use a burn to help get rid of some of that woody encroachment, one of your objectives may be to remove 75% of the woody encroachment within that stand, and that is measurable. So post-burn, we can then go back in and look and see, did we meet the objective for that burn? If we did, fantastic. And if we didn't, we can look at the different things that went into the burn and maybe see what we could change up to help us reach those objectives. These objectives will be clearly outlined in your prescribed burn plan. And then it's always important to remember that even when planning, we really need to use adaptive management as our approach, which means that these objectives may change over time, and they should really be based on the site conditions at the time of the burn. So that means you don't really want like a cookie cutter plan or a cookie cutter objective. You really want to make those objectives and plan according to what that site is like, because not all sites are created equal. So some common management objectives that folks might have is fuel load reduction. So, you know, a lot of people, they associate we use prescribed fire with just wildlife management, but there's other uses of prescribed fire, and one of those is fuel load reduction. So that's going to reduce your wildfire hazard. Another thing you might be interested in doing is if you're going out and reestablishing native grasses and wildflowers, you can use prescribed burning in the site prep process of those native plantings. The habitat restoration and management is, you know, one of the most common ones you probably hear about. So that's once you have a stand established, we use periodic fire to help manage those stands. And also through our woodlands, we use fire to help open up those stands. And, you know, if you're doing like a woodland restoration or savanna restoration, we use fire as a management tool to keep those stands open. Another one that we use prescribed fire for is to maintain cultural landscapes. So the picture here on the left is actually a picture that I took when we burned the Pea Ridge National Military Park. And they use burning out there not only to promote the native grasses, but also to maintain the historical conditions of the battlefield. So they actually have been able to use written accounts from soldiers who were on the battlefield at that time, they described what the landscape looked like, and we've been able to use those to make sure that we keep these historical and cultural landscapes intact the way they would have been. So now that we've gone over some of the common objectives that some landowners may have, and there's plenty more than that. Those are just some of the more common ones that we see. You may have other objectives besides those that I just went through. So where do we burn? So what land uses can we use prescribed fire on? So prairies and open grasslands. So there's many reasons why we would use fire on these areas. As I mentioned earlier, site prep for native planting. So by using prescribed burning, following herbicide applications, we can actually burn off all of that thatch if there's enough fuel load, because for these native plantings, we want to ensure that we get the most seed to soil contact as possible. So we can use prescribed fire just to kind of clean up that seed bed to make sure that that seed is actually able to hit the soil. Then we can also use prescribed burning to control undesirable species in the stand. You know, sometimes we oftentimes will use prescribed burning in combination with other methods such as herbicide use in order to really make sure that we get good site prep for these native plantings. We'll also use it, so once you have a stand established, we can use prescribed fire to encourage the diversity. So again, Arkansas landscape was shaped by fire. Our prairies, our grasslands, most of the species that are on these sites adapted with fire and actually require fire. So we can help use prescribed fire burning during different seasons, which we'll talk about later, to promote your forb or your wildflowers within the stand. We can use prescribed burning during our dormant seasons to remove debris and thatch that's been accumulating on the ground, which can hinder new growth. Again, we can use it for invasive species control. These invasive species will compete with our natives. And a lot of these invasive species are not fire dependent. They do not evolve with fire. So we can actually use prescribed fire as a control means for some of these species. And then for woody encroachment, as I mentioned earlier, if you leave a grass stand sitting there, slowly over time, without doubt, you will start to get woody encroachment, whether that's cedar, persimmon, sumac, blackberry. You're going to start to get some woody encroachment in the stand. And while a little bit of woody growth is not bad, in fact, we often encourage people to incorporate shrubs into these native plantings. If you leave it over time, the woody growth will eventually take over the field, and before you know it, you've got a forest where it once was open grassland. So we can use fire during certain times of the year, run it through these fields, and help to keep that woody encroachment back to maintain these as actual prairies and open grasslands. So these are just some pictures that we've used. So again, the site prep picture here on the left. So this was a landowner we had that was getting a site ready for a native planting. He had dropped a bunch of cedars, went through and sprayed the grasses with chemical, and then he came in and did a prescribed burn. So now you can see, besides all the cedar skeletons, you can see there's a lot of bare ground. So when they go to seed this site, they're going to get really good seed to soil contact on this site because they went and burned all that thatch up. And then the picture on the left is another burn where we're going through and we're burning off. So this site, the grasses were getting a little thick, so we were going to go in there and burn to hopefully help set back some of those grasses and promote our forbs or our wildflowers to be able to come up in this stand. So then we move on to forest land. So there's a lot of forest land in Arkansas. And there's, again, many reasons why we burn through our woods, whether it's closed canopy forest systems or open woodlands. So one of the reasons is fuel load reduction. So over time, especially in hardwood forests, you get just that accumulation of leaf litter on the bottom. If there's an ice storm or any type of storm damage that comes through, you'll get an accumulation of stuff just piling on the forest floor. So we can use prescribed burning to go in and reduce that fuel load, which will, also decrease your wildfire hazards for that area. Just like in our native grasslands, we can use prescribed fire as an invasive species control. So again, it's going to target those undesirable species within the stand. I'm going to mention cedar several times in this because that's one of the key woody species that we're looking to manage here in Arkansas, especially within our woodlands. So, cedar, for example, are not fire resistant. So fire will do a very good job of killing at least young cedar as management and get those out of the stand. As I mentioned before, we use prescribed fire to create and maintain those open conditions. So just as a management tool, if you go in and you do, so at the bottom, we can do use prescribed burning for site prep, for thinning practices. So if you're going to go in and do any thinning to kind of open up that system, create those more woodland conditions, it's going to let that sunlight come through, let grasses and wildflowers start growing up on the forest floor. But we also use prescribed burning before we thin, and that's just going to help improve your ease of access to those areas to do that work in. And it'll also at the same time, hopefully, if the fire is right and you get a good burn, will also help to take out some of those smaller species, and you don't have to actually go in there and use chemical or anything to kill those. So it'll kill some of the species in there and also just make it easier to move through the stand to do any thinning practices. And then again, encouraging that herbaceous availability and diversity within our forest lands. So maintaining those open conditions will allow for those grasses and wildflowers to grow. And that's going to be the forage source for your wildlife here in Arkansas. So in our closed canopy forest systems, like we see across the state now, there's no forage there for wildlife. There's just really no resources in there for them to use. So by putting fire back on the landscape, we can get those conditions opened back up. And so here's a couple pictures of just some burns in forest lands that we've done here in Arkansas. And then agricultural land. So the last land use we'll talk about just briefly are agricultural land. So on grazing land. So people where they've got, especially cattle. I know patch burn grazing has been a growing thing in several states, and hopefully maybe one day we can implement some of that here in Arkansas. But grazing land, so when you burn, that encourages the growth of new nutrient-rich grasses, and the cattle will actually prefer those new freshly burned areas with that new fresh forage growing in them. We can use them as invasive species control, very similar to just our prairies and grasslands. You know, the woody stuff will start to encroach into our grazing lands as well. So we can use burning to help control those. And then also in croplands. So people use prescribed burning on croplands as well. So they use them as site prep burns for planting. When you're burning, you're also building that organic matter of the soil. You're adding nutrients into the soil. And also the same for invasive and woody species control in those areas as well. So here's just some pictures. So here's a picture on the left of some cattle in an area that's been recently burned. So once that new growth starts to come in after that burn, those cattle are going to preferentially graze those fresh areas. And that also gives time for the other unburned areas to rest. So some people, in lieu of putting up, you know, fences, cross fencing, they will actually use burning kind of as a tool to rotationally graze their cattle. And that's kind of that patch burn grazing system. And then on the right here, we see a picture of some crop fields being burned. So now going into when we burn. So we've talked about why we're burning, where we're burning. So now a little bit about when we burn. So burn seasonality. So when burning during certain times of the year has different effects. So you'll probably often hear a term, if you start looking into prescribed fire, we have dormant season burns. And those are typically burns that are conducted from November through to March, and that ending date kind of depends on where you live. So in some places you might start getting green up a little bit earlier than in other places, but typically November through March is considered dormant season, and we use these dormant season burns in both forests and in grasslands. So we use them to remove leaf litter and fuel. So again, the fuel reduction, if fuel reduction is one of your objectives, we'll typically do one of these dormant season burns. They can also top kill those saplings to help with that woody encroachment. We typically see more intense flames during these burns because most of the fuels are dead. Those plants have gone dormant. So we've got a lot of, as you can see in the bottom picture here, a lot of just dead, dry fuel. Most of the time when we're burning our woods, if they're not really open woodlands or savannas, especially when we're first starting with these projects, we will typically burn through our forest during the dormant season because we see less tree damage during dormant season burns. They will encourage grasses in our grasslands. So when we're burning during this time frame in our grasslands, it is used to encourage those grasses. It'll clean up that thatch layer. We typically see less smoke because of the cooler air temperatures, and we get better smoke dispersion because there's more wind. So we'll see the smoke from these fires. It'll get up and it'll lift out of the atmosphere. It doesn't quite linger to the ground as much as growing season burns, which we'll talk about here shortly. However, it is important to note that during these dormant season burns, because of the fuel types often associated, that dead fuel, we do have more spotting potential. And spotting is when you have fire that crosses your fire line and starts to burn in an area outside of the burn unit. So typically with these dormant season burns, we do have a little bit more spotting potential. So again, some of the more common uses for these dormant season burns are going to be fuel load reduction and just kind of a general cleanup burn, if you will. And then oftentimes we're using dormant season burns as site prep for our native plantings. So on the other side of that, we have growing season burns. So growing season burns are typically conducted in Arkansas from August to October. So it's kind of that late growing season, not early, but late growing season burns. These burns often remove less fuel because, you know, you haven't had leaf off yet. And a lot of these fuels, excuse me, a lot of these fuels, when you're burning during that time, are still going to be green. So you're going to get a very patchy burn often, which is fine because that can actually leave cover and habitat intact for the wildlife to use. So areas that haven't been burned. We'll often use growing season burns to just kill saplings outright, because when you're burning them during that growing season, you're getting more tree damage. So when we have issues with woody encroachment, whether it's in our fields or whether it's in an open woodland or savanna, we'll use these growing season burns to help control some of those saplings. In our grasslands, we use growing season burns to encourage forbs, because when we burn grasses when they're actively growing during this time, it'll set them back because grasses will outcompete your wildflowers when they're growing. So oftentimes after so many years of being planted, we have to go in and kind of reset those grasses back a little bit so that we don't lose our forb component within these stands. With growing season burns, we typically see more smoke because of the higher air temperatures and because of the type of fuel that we're burning. You get a little bit more smoldering and then typically less wind, so less smoke dispersion. So you can see in this bottom picture, that smoke is just kind of hovering there on the ground. It's not lifting as well as we saw in the dormant season burns. The good thing about these is there's less of that spotting potential like we saw in the dormant season burns. And as I said, growing season burns tend to be very patchy because a lot of the fuel load is still green. So the fire will kind of burn really well through some areas, and other areas it'll just either creep through or it'll just completely extinguish because there's too much moisture in that fuel for it to actually burn. So it'll definitely leave a lot of patchiness in the burn unit. So again, some of the common management goals that we will use growing season burns to achieve would be that habitat restoration and management. When we're doing native grass stands and habitat management, we like to alternate between those dormant and growing season burns because that's how our landscape would historically. You wouldn't have seen the landscape only burning in the winter or only burning in the summer. So oftentimes we'll switch up when we use growing season burns versus when we use dormant season burns, using that adaptive management thinking based on what the site needs. We can go out there and make sure that that stand is being maintained. And also, as I said, for invasive species control, so the picture on the right, the Sericea lespedeza, which is a common undesirable invasive species that we try to control here in Arkansas, especially in our grasslands. We use fire, not necessarily to kill Sericea, but we can use it in conjunction with herbicide to help get rid of it faster within stands. But we burned this field of Sericea. It actually, surprisingly, with how green it is, it burned very well. And with a combination of the burn and herbicide, and I didn't put a picture of the after results in here, but we were able to significantly control the Sericea within this stand. So now I have just a few videos to show you all. I couldn't get the sound to work. You don't really need the sound. But so these first videos that I'm going to show you are of growing season burns. So again, the growing season is going to be from August to October. So this first one is in a grass field that we burned, and the second one is going to be through some open woodland. So I'll just play those real quick. So a lot of this in this video will look a little dead. They did go in and do some herbicide treatments prior to the prescribed burn, which is why a lot of that fuel in there still looks dead, and why you're getting some higher flame lengths. But you can see that fire is moving pretty quickly across there. It's not staying in one spot too long. And then you can notice too, there's patches where the fire is just kind of going around patches and it's not burning. And then this growing season burn through the woodlands, you'll really see how slow this fire is creeping. So you can barely see the flames. There's definitely a lot more smoke. It's just kind of creeping through this stand again because there's quite a bit of moisture still in those fuels. So if they had burned this during the dormant season, after all those fuels had already gone dormant and were much drier, the fire would have behaved very differently within this stand. You see all the smoke and it's just kind of lingering there on the ground. No big flames, nothing too crazy. And see, very patchy. The fire wants to burn really well in some areas, and other areas it's just leaving completely unburned, which is fine, again, because a lot of the wildlife will be able to use those unburned patches for forage and cover as well. All right, so now moving into those dormant season burns. So dormant season burns, they get a little bit because of the different fuel load. See a little bit bigger flame lengths, but this first one is of a dormant season burn through a grass field that we did. And this burn was a very good burn because we actually did this with one of the state representatives, Jack Fortner. And that just shows you where we're coming with prescribed burning here in Arkansas, that we're even getting our state representatives interested in burning, wanting to burn their own property. So we went out and helped him burn this property. You see higher flame lengths. There's really not much that fire is not going to burn up. It's all dead, dry fuel. You know, we lit some strips in there so that fire is just pulling together really nicely. Much higher flame lengths, moving fairly quickly across that field. And you can see all in the back everywhere where it's already burned. So that fire was moving very quickly through that dry fuel. And again, this burn was just kind of a cleanup burn. That dormant season burn, our goal was to really just go in there and remove a lot of the thatch from previous year's growth that you can see has accumulated. And then right here in the video, you can see on the hill, there's really not much that's left unburned from that portion up at the top that we had already burned. We really got a good, and none of the trees would have really been hurt during that because that fire really just moved through there so quickly, which is why we typically use them in, like in this next video, we use them in our woodlands and our forest systems because we don't see the tree mortality because that fire just gets to moving. You see that smoke is getting up and getting out of there a lot better than it was during those growing season burns. So in this burn was the same during a dormant season, really just that fuel load reduction. And he had been going in there and was doing some thinning. So he had a lot of debris just left on the ground. So we just went in there with a burn to clean it up. And so hopefully he can get back in there and do a little bit more work on thinning, getting rid of some more of those undesirable species. And that fire, we were able to knock out a lot of the small cedar trees. He had a lot of small cedar trees growing up through the stand. And this burn was a couple hundred acres. He had a lot of small cedars, and we were able to use this burn to really go in there and hammer some of those saplings. And then just to end it all, some key takeaways that I hope you all really take away from this webinar is that not all fire is created equal. So we kind of saw the difference between the growing season versus the dormant season versus burning in grasslands versus burning in woodlands. Planning is key to successful prescribed burning. We saw the difference between a prescribed burn and a wildfire, and planning is key to that. Fire shape the Arkansas landscape, and it's an important tool in our land manager's toolbox. Not the only tool we have, and fire can't be used just on its own. Fire is not the cure-all, but it's definitely one of the most important tools that we have at our disposal. It's very cost-effective to use compared to other management techniques. So making sure that we can get it back on the landscape will just help us to improve do ecosystem restoration to a whole nother level. Burning should always be done to meet quantitative objectives. So again, we don't just go out there and light a match to light a match. We have a reason that we're lighting the match, and those should be measurable objectives, and they should always be outlined in your prescribed burn plan. Prescribed fire, like I said, is a very versatile tool. So it can be used on basically any land use where management of native ecosystems is an objective. So we can use prescribed fire in one way or another to meet most objectives, and to meet multiple objectives at one time as well, which is what makes fire so effective, is that it can reach multiple objectives using one singular tool. And then fire seasonality plays an important part in using fire as a management tool. So knowing when to burn is a critical part of that planning process. And always be smart, plan before you start. So, I always like to end presentations with my favorite quote from Mr. John Muir is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So when it comes to prescribed burning, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. There's a lot of considerations that we have to take into consideration. But when we do, and we use it the way that it should be used on the landscape, it's a pretty nice picture. And with that, I'll go ahead and end the presentation, and I will open it up for any questions. We've got about 15 minutes left, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, or there's not so many of us that if you wanted to, just unmute yourself and ask away. Nobody's got any questions? Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then